some of the famous people with the name Daniel, and they don't behave as if God is their judge. So this is literally how you would say in Hebrew, God is my judge, and is this word. The first part of the word, Dan is an old Sumerian word, which means judge. And so the name Daniel is actually a really old name. It shows up in a lot of old Canaanite literature and some other old, like Assyrian literature and stuff. So it's a fairly, I don't know if you'd say common ancient Near East name, but it's a very old name, older than the prophet Daniel. And so you can see on the end of the name there, it looks like an X and then an L kind of. That's L on the end, and that's the word for God. So if you break it out, D-A-N means judge, and then the I means my, and then the E-L on the end means God. And if you want to look at it from the English. Okay, so Daniel, he's taken captive to Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar in 605. And then he's going to record the downfall of Babylon to the Persians in 539. So he's going to live throughout the entire Neo-Babylonian period and into the Persian period. So his ministry is going to span about 70 years. So he's going to be fairly young when he is a captive, taken from Jerusalem into Babylon. And then he'll eventually die in Babylon, which becomes Persia at that point. So he's going to span about 70 years, and the entire time when Babylon is the world power, he'll be living in Babylon. Okay, so if you want to kind of play with some numbers, if you want to say that maybe he was around 15 when he was taken captive, and that's totally a guess, but if you want to guess that he's somewhere around 15, then he would have lived to around the age 85. And so those 70 years he would have spent in Babylon. He is mentioned in some other places in Scripture. Ezekiel mentions him several times. They are contemporaries with each other living in Babylon. I'll talk a little bit more about Ezekiel later. I'll mention a couple of these things as we go through this. Some of this stuff is for what you might call critical studies in the Old Testament, where people try to say, oh, this person didn't write this or whatever. So I'll point out a couple of those things just in case you ever happen to come across it on the internet or somebody tries to say something to you to kind of weaken your faith. So in Ezekiel, Daniel's name is spelled slightly different than it is in the book of Daniel. So that makes some people say, well, that's two different Daniels, it's not the same guy. It doesn't mean anything. A lot of the names in the Old Testament are sometimes spelled different ways in different places, especially some of the kings. Some of the kings their names are spelled different, and it doesn't mean anything. For instance, like Joash is sometimes called Jehoash. Joram is sometimes called Jehoram. So the names kind of get played around with a little bit. It doesn't mean they're nicknames, and the other doesn't mean that it's not the same individual. So don't let that confuse you. And then Jesus mentions Daniel twice, or in two different locations, once in Matthew and once in Mark. And he does confirm that the message of Daniel actually is true and is from the prophet Daniel. And then he's alluded to in Hebrews 11:33, but not named by name. Okay, so two possible sites of his tomb by tradition. This isn't provable. There's the royal vault in Babylon, and then there's a synagogue in Susa that claims to be his burial site. And then there's a bunch of other ones that you can randomly find on the internet. But these are the two most likely. And so I'll show you the one in Susa. This is the one in Susa, which is now called Shush Aran. And so a lot of Muslims and Jews that live in that area go to visit this site. You can see the image on the right, the person's bowing. So that's inside the synagogue there. And they're bowing before the tomb or crouching in front of the tomb there. So where is Shush Aran? It's where Susa used to be. So if if I can get this to work. Okay. So as you kind of look at it, in the middle of the circle there is Basra, Iraq, and you can see the border between Iraq and Iran goes up the middle of the screen there. You can see Baghdad in the center there. So Susa is in Iran, but pretty close to the border with Iraq. And this is where Susa used to be located. Susa is going to become an important city when you get to the Persian period. But it's a very important Babylonian site as well. So this is where he probably was, or maybe was buried. If you want to look, Tehran, Iran, is way up here in the north. So just to give you a little bit of an idea. And then as far as in the city of Shush itself, you got the remains of Susa over here, and then you got the tomb right here. And then down the street, you got this clinic called Daniel Clinic, which is kind of funny. So there's a clinic a couple blocks away, but with the name Daniel as well. So that's in Shush, Iran. Doesn't look like a huge city, but anyway. Okay, so as far as authorship and date, there's a lot of theories out there, and I'm not going to waste your time with the more silly ones. Basically, it comes down to two things. One, either you think Daniel wrote it, or two, you don't think Daniel wrote it. And I'm just going to skip the ones where people say Daniel didn't write it and just go with the traditional view that Daniel is the author of the book. And so if you look at it from that standpoint, he would have finished the book sometime after the last event that's recorded in the book, which is in chapter 10. So that would have been around the year 536 BC. In English Bibles, the book is in the last of the four major prophets. So, you have Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then Daniel. And those are called your four major prophets. And then you have all the minor prophets that we've been looking at so far. In the Hebrew Bible, though, that is not where Daniel falls, which also gives some people some issues. It doesn't mean anything. So if you were to go look at a Jewish Bible, which they call the Tanakh, Daniel is not in the same location. So in the Hebrew Bible, if you don't know it, the Hebrew Bible is broken into three sections. It's the exact same material that's in our Old Testament, just the order of the books are a little different. And so it's broken into three sections, and they call it the Tanakh, so just think about it as the letter T, N, and K, and they just add the A's in to make a word out of it. So T, N, and K. The T stands for Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That's the same. And then the last two sections, the N and the K, N stands for Nevi'im, which means the prophets, which is basically all the prophets we're used to, except Daniel's not in there. And then you have the writings, which is the K, which stands for Ketuvim. And Daniel in the Hebrew Bible falls into the writings category instead of the prophets category. And that causes some people issues why that would be the case. And I don't want to get into all that because, one, it would bore you, and probably two, confuse you. But the reason to kind of bring it up is just to point out when the Jews were deciding how they wanted to arrange the Bible, they put Daniel in the writings because he's viewed at primarily, you have to decide, okay, are you going to weigh him as a government official, or are you going to weigh him as a prophet? Now, the reality is he's both, so they're not denying one or the other. They're just saying, if you had to put more weight on one or the other, how would you weigh him? And so they decided to label him more as a government official who happened to do prophecy instead of a prophet who happened to be a government official. And so that's why it falls into the writing section instead of the prophet section in a Jewish Bible. Okay, as far as the texts go, I'm going to come back to this in a minute, but just to let you know up front, there's only a couple books in the Old Testament that are multilingual, and this is one of them. So about half of the book is in Hebrew, and the other half is in Aramaic. I'll give you a gold star if you know what the other book is in the Old Testament that's like that. Anybody? All right. You can ponder it for a minute. Don't Google it, though. If you think about it, just think, okay, what would come late time-wise as far as Old Testament books? I'll swing back around to it in a minute and see if anybody has a guess. So multiple copies have been found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later. Okay, so now we're going to go through some of the historical background to kind of help some of this make sense. So again, if you want to kind of make a guess, we'll say Daniel's roughly 15-ish when he is taken captive. But he was taken captive in 605. We know that part. So what's going to happen is, and I'll cover some of this in a minute, but if you remember, this whole time we've been talking about Assyria, Assyria, Assyria with all these prophets. Now Assyria is finally gone. Assyria is finally defeated. They're off the map. They're not a country anymore. And so they fell in 612 BC to the Babylonians as well as the Medes and Persians, and I think the Scythians maybe helped a little bit with that. But we'll focus on the Babylonians. So the Babylonians defeat Assyria, and so Assyria is no longer a country, no longer a world power, and they're completely absorbed by Babylon. So if you back up a little bit, before Assyria falls, Josiah is going to be the king of Judah, and then Assyria is going to fall in 612. That's when Nineveh falls. Technically, the country kind of hangs on briefly for a little while, but that's essentially when they fall. And then in 609, Josiah, who's king of Judah, is going to get killed by the Egyptian pharaoh Necho. Okay, and so you have a lot of things turning over here in a very short period of time. So you go from Assyria being the world power to a completely not existent as a country anymore. Babylon rises to become a country. And then Judah's king, which is Josiah, gets killed in battle to Pharaoh of Egypt. Okay, so this is the map of Assyria when Assyria was at their largest. You can see two colors on the screen. I'm colorblind. The lighter color, which I'm going to guess is yellow, marks their biggest expanse that they ever got to. And you can see that they controlled a lot of Egypt, obviously Judah, Israel, when Israel was a country, and all these little countries here along the coast, like Lebanon now, Syria back then, Phoenicia, Ammon, Moab, Edom, etc. And then they controlled way up into Turkey, or what was Turkey back then. And then all of what would be modern day Iraq, a little bit of Iran, and then some of Saudi Arabia as well. So that's Assyria. So we know that then Babylon is going to come in and take over, which is now this. So this is the Babylonian Empire. And one of their main cities is going to be Ur, which is down here. Another gold star from anybody who knows the famous Bible character from Ur, Abraham. I think you said Abraham. I'm going to pretend you said Abraham. Abraham is from Ur originally. The next bonus question, when he left Ur, where did he go? Anybody? Huh? Good. He left Ur and went to Haran, which is in the middle of the circle way up there. And then from Haran, he's going to come down to Palestine later. But so that's older history. So Babylon's going to defeat Assyria, and then they're basically going to take all of Babylon or Assyria's kingdom from them. Okay, so now at this point, you got two major world powers. You got Babylon. Whoops. I don't know what just happened. All right, you got Babylon, and then you got the Medes and the Persians, which are going to be over here, which are going to come into play a little bit later on, okay? And so I may have this on the next slide. So what ends up happening is the Babylonians defeat Assyria at Assyria's capital, which is Nineveh, in the middle of the circle there. Remember, Nineveh is where Jonah went to prophesy, but that was a long time before what we're talking about now. Jonah would have gone to Nineveh around 760. We're now down to 605. So Jonah would have went there about 150-ish years prior to this. Okay, so what ends up happening is Babylon defeats Assyria at Nineveh, and then Assyria kind of hangs on for a few years, and Egypt tries to help Assyria fight against Babylon. Now, why would they do that? What Egypt was hoping is that if they helped Assyria, then Egypt would take over all of this area and get basically the western half of the Assyrian Empire, and Assyria would just go back home and take over the eastern part of their empire. And so they thought, if we help Assyria, then we will gain all of this trade route right through here, which goes through Jerusalem, and we'll take over the coast, and then Assyria can go back over here. So they're trying to defeat Babylon to basically increase their empire as well. So these three nations come together and fight at a battle up here in Turkey, modern-day Turkey, at a place called Carchemish. And at Carchemish, Babylon defeats Egypt. That wipes out Assyria. And then Egypt goes back home, and they never leave here again, even till today. They've never expanded again since then. So that was basically the end of Egypt's attempt to expand, and the end of the Assyrian Empire. And so after that, Babylon takes over this whole map, basically. Now, Assyria was a world power for quite a while. Several centuries they were the world power. Babylon's going to be the world power, but for a very brief window of time, only about 70 years. Okay, so they're not going to be a world player very long, and what's going to end up happening is they're going to get defeated eventually by the Medes and the Persians, is who's going to take them over. Okay. All right, so as you look at the history with this, so Josiah gets killed in 609. And this is where it starts to get kind of murky and confusing, because you get a rapid turnover of kings of Judah pretty quick. They're all related to Josiah, if that makes it easier to kind of remember. They're either Josiah's son or they're Josiah's grandson, and that's all of the rest of them. All right, so Josiah, the first one after Josiah dies that becomes king is his son Jehoahaz. He becomes king, but he only reigns for 3 months, and then the Pharaoh that killed Josiah takes him off the throne and puts his brother, who actually is older, on the throne instead, and that's Jehoiakim. So Jehoiakim ends up reigning as king from 609 to 597. After defeating Egypt at Carchemish, in 605, so that battle I was telling you about where Egypt gets beat and Assyria gets beat by Babylon, that was in 605. So after, if you go back and you look at the map, so Babylon's going to win this major victory up here at Carchemish. Egypt has to go back home, and so Babylon can then come down the coast and take over everything in the process. And as they come down the coast, they're going to invade Jerusalem as they come down the coast, okay? So that battle is in 605. So they're going to come into Jerusalem, Babylon is, in 605, and they're going to take Daniel and his friends into captivity in 605, okay? And at this point, Judah becomes a vassal of Babylon. So what you're going to end up having is 3 waves of deportation to Babylon from Judah, and this is the first wave, okay? So Daniel gets taken captive in the first wave of deportees from Judah back to Babylon. Okay, now Jehoiakim is still king, and when Babylon comes down and takes over and makes Jerusalem and Judah a vassal of Babylon, Jehoiakim promises to be a good boy and be loyal to King Nebuchadnezzar. but he ends up rebelling later on, and I'm going to come back to this, I think, in a minute. But he rebels, so then Nebuchadnezzar puts Jerusalem under siege for 3 months. Somehow during this time, and nobody seems to know exactly what happened, somehow Jehoiakim dies while the siege is happening. And so then his son, who is Josiah's grandson, Jehoiachin, becomes king, but he only reigns for 3 months, and then he has to surrender the city to Nebuchadnezzar on March 15th or 16th in 597. And so he reigns for 3 months, and then he is taken captive and goes to Babylon. So this is your second wave of deportation to Babylon. So the first one is in 605, the second one's in 597. In 597, they take about 10,000 people captive back to Babylon. In the 605 deportation, Daniel went into captivity along with his friends. In the second wave of deportation, the king, which is Jehoiachin, and Ezekiel are going to go into captivity during the second wave. Okay. Now, Jehoiachin is important from an archaeological and historical standpoint. I think I mentioned this to you before in one of the other books we looked at. So he's only king for 3 months, but he's going to live a long time in Babylon. He lives as a prisoner for a long time until you get down to a later king of Babylon who actually releases him from prison and then treats him very well and lets him come and eat at his table anytime he wants to, and treats him basically like a part of the royal family or a friend of the royal family. And that's recorded, I think it's the very last verse or two of 2 Kings or 2 Chronicles, maybe both. If you want to flip over there and look at that, you can see that. So even though he's only king for a very short time, he does live a long time in Babylon. So the reason it's important from an archaeological standpoint, they've actually found pieces of pottery with writing on it in Babylon that has his name on it. So what they would do is they'd write out and say, this is the rations this person's supposed to get each day or whatever. And his rations, how much he got, and his name is on some of the pottery that they found to confirm that he really was a real person and that he did actually live in Babylon as a captive. Okay. And so after he is no longer king, then Zedekiah, who's Josiah's third son now to become king, is made king of Judah. He will be Judah's last king, and he's going to reign from 597 to 586. You know, you'd think they would learn their lesson, but they don't. He eventually rebels too against Nebuchadnezzar. And so at this point, the Babylonian king is just tired of fooling with the Jews. They keep rebelling, and he has to keep coming back and put them down. And at this point, he just says, enough's enough. And he decides to end this situation. And so he puts Jerusalem under siege again on January 15th, 588, and succeeds in capturing it on July 18th, 586. So it was under siege for 2.5 years. So after the city falls in July, he ends up destroying the city in August, destroying the temple, destroying the city walls, and everything in it, taking all the stuff out of the temple, and taking all the people of any real value from their perspective back to Babylon to serve Babylon. Okay, so as you kind of look at all this, Daniel's going to end up living through the final 5 kings of Judah, the overthrow of the nation, and the destruction of the city and the temple. Now, for a lot of that, he's already in Babylon. He's not in Jerusalem firsthand seeing all this happen, but he's alive when this stuff is happening. He most likely would have heard Jeremiah and possibly Habakkuk preach in Jerusalem when he was a kid. He and Ezekiel overlapped as exiles in Babylon. And it seems to indicate that they know each other, or at least know of each other, based on some things that are said. And Ezekiel would have also heard Jeremiah and probably Habakkuk preach as well. Okay, So Daniel's going to live through the entire Neo-Babylonian Empire period. So this is kind of the part of the history I skipped. Let me just kind of back up. So the first king of Babylon is a dude called Nabopolassar. His name means, "O Nabu, protect the heir." So you can see that there's some concern about their lineage being maintained. Nabu is one of their gods that they worship. So that's what his name means. So he rises up. So before he becomes king, Babylon is part of Assyria. Assyria and Babylon have this long history where sometimes they're separate countries. Most of the time they're countries together, but either an Assyrian king or a Babylonian king is the main guy ruling and controlling everything. And so when he starts to get power, he breaks away from Assyria. And he becomes king in 625 BC. And he's going to start rebelling against Assyria, and then he eventually beats them in 612 to take over all of Assyria's territory. His son is Nebuchadnezzar. So you probably haven't heard of Nabopolassar, but you know his son, Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar means O Nabu, watch over my heir. So it's kind of a similar name to his father's name. So he is the one who defeats Egypt at Carchemish. So he is the main general of the army under his father, and he's the one who wins the battle at Carchemish in 605. And then a few months later, his father is going to die, and so he becomes king at that point. And so by the time they stroll down into Jerusalem, after they won up in Carchemish, he is the king at that point. All right, so he's going to reign for a long time, a little over 40 years, and then he's going to die in 562. More is said in the Bible about him as far as foreign kings than any other foreign king, with the exception of the Pharaoh of the Exodus. After his death, the empire starts to unravel quickly. So the same thing that happened in Assyria, once the last really good king of Assyria died, the country fell apart in a little over 20 years. The same thing's going to happen in Babylon. After their really good king dies, the country falls apart in 23 years. Something for us to think about with our country. It doesn't take long for a country to fall apart. Then after his death, his son, Amil Marduk, becomes king. His name means man of Marduk, and I point that out because in the Bible he's called, it looks like evil, Merodach is how you pronounce it in English. Evil, it does not mean evil, okay? So he's not a bad guy, is not what that means. The name is literally man of Marduk. Marduk is another one of their gods they worship. What happens with these names is, not to bore you too much, but you have a whole set of Semitic languages, meaning languages that all derive from the same type of language system. And so Assyrian is one, and that dominates in the East. Hebrew, Aramaic, and so forth are what you call Western Semitic languages. And so even though the languages are very similar and behave similarly, sometimes letters get switched when you go from East to West or whatever. And that's why the names are sometimes spelled differently, and that's how you end up with these different names. Anyway, so when you see him in the Bible, he's called Evil Merodach, but his actual name, if you were talking to him in Assyria or in Babylon, would be Amil Marduk. Okay, so he's going to be king very briefly, and then he gets assassinated by his brother-in-law, Neriglissar, who is called Negal-Sharezer in Jeremiah, okay? And then he's going to only reign for a few years, and then he dies, and then his son becomes king, and then he's assassinated only after 3 months and then Nabonidus becomes king. Nabonidus is actually Nebuchadnezzar's son-in-law. So all these guys, they're all related to each other, even though they're assassinating each other and stuff. Okay, so Nabonidus is the last king of Babylon, but he's going to reign with his son. They're going to be co-kings together. and his son's name is Belshazzar, and Belshazzar is going to be a prominent figure in the book of Daniel. You'll see him come up in the book. So even though he's co-regent, he's kind of the main figure, at least from the book of Daniel's standpoint. And so they're going to be the last kings of Babylon, and then they'll eventually get defeated by the Medes and the Persians. Okay, so there are some other countries that you need to know about in the book, but we'll just talk about them when we get to them. We're not going to spend time on them right now. Okay, as far as literature goes, the first 6 chapters are mostly historical. You know, that's the stuff you're used to, Daniel and the Lion's Den, those kind of things. The last 6 chapters are history, but a lot of prophetic, apocalyptic type of literature in it. So the first 6 chapters will be pretty straightforward. The last 6 are a little bit more like the book of Revelation. Some things to keep in mind when you're looking at the apocalyptic part of the literature. I found this, and it's kind of helpful to kind of keep in mind as you're looking at it. So the Revelation, as you're trying to interpret what it's saying, remember that the revelation is given by God. It's going to be given through a mediator. Obviously in Revelation, the mediator is Jesus. Here it's going to be an angel. It's given to a seer, in this case to Daniel. It's going to be about stuff to happen in the future. It's going to be given during a time of persecution or historical crisis. The information will be given to the seer in the way of visions. The visions will have a lot of symbolism in it, as well as some numerology. But the main theme of all this, just like in the main theme of Revelation, is that God will triumph and God is in control. You need to kind of keep that in the back of your mind. You don't want to get drugged down by the details of it all, because the details are not necessarily always meant to mean anything. They're more of colorful imagery to kind of make the story pop a little bit more. Okay, back to the language part. So the book is written in 2 languages. The first chapter and the first few verses of chapter 2 are Hebrew. Then you're going to have the whole middle of the book is Aramaic, and then you're going to go back to Hebrew. So when you break it down by verses, there's actually more Aramaic in the book than there is Hebrew. The portions written in Hebrew, there's theories on why would Daniel write it in 2 different languages. The best explanation is that some of the book he writes intending for a larger, like, Gentile audience to read it or be interested in it. And then some of it he writes more for the Jewish audience. So the parts that are more interesting to the Jews only is written in Hebrew. The part that he really wants to emphasize for the Gentile world to read is written in Aramaic. Okay, so why Aramaic? What is this? Has the first bell ring? I don't want to bore you too much with languages, but you might want to know why this is happening if you have never heard this before. So the Jews spoke Hebrew before they go into captivity. Okay, so that's their language. That's the language they write in. When they go into captivity, they're going to live in another country for 70 years. And while they're there, obviously the kids are born, the kids grow up. It would be like you moving to Germany. You'll speak English in Germany, but what are your kids going to grow up speaking? German, okay? What are your grandkids going to speak? German. By the time you hit your grandkids, will they even speak English? Well, they would in Germany, but you know what I mean. I should have picked a different country. Anyway, the point is when you move to a different country, you're going to learn the language of that country, right? So when the Jews go to Babylon, they learn to speak Aramaic. And when they come back to Judah, once they're released from captivity and they come back, they don't speak Hebrew anymore. They speak Aramaic. Now, some of them can still read Hebrew, like the priests and the scribes who need to be able to transcribe the Old Testament and keep it going. They can read Hebrew and they can speak Hebrew, but the average person doesn't speak or read Hebrew anymore. They only know Aramaic. And so by the time you get down to Jesus, Jews don't speak Hebrew anymore. they speak Aramaic, okay? And that's why this is relevant. So they learn Aramaic when they go into captivity, all right? And so, let me see okay, so this is what this slide is showing you. So this is two languages on the screen. The language in white is Hebrew. The language in Aramaic is Aramaic. Sorry, the language in yellow is Aramaic. And so that's just, verse 4 of chapter 2. It's split in half. The first half is in Hebrew. The second half is in Aramaic. What you'll notice, or you actually might not notice, but the letters are the same letters for both languages. What happened was the Jews originally wrote Hebrew in a different, what you call a script or letter system. It's very similar to this, but it did look different, a little bit different. And when they went into captivity and they learned Aramaic, they just learned to write Hebrew with the Aramaic letters. And so now when you read Hebrew, you're actually reading Hebrew, but with an Aramaic writing system, or meaning the letters are Aramaic letters. And so all the letters on the screen are Aramaic, even though you're looking at two different languages, okay? And so that's why this becomes a little bit relevant when you start thinking about like with Jesus and what Jesus taught and stuff like that. There is a word on here, this verb right there. If you're into like more academic studies at all, you may have heard of peshers before. The Jews, after they come back from captivity, they start developing things called the Talmud and the Midrash and the Pesher and all that stuff. And they're different. Some of it's like commentary, like for us, if you read a commentary. So some of it's like commentaries on scripture and things like that. And that's where this word comes from for the Peshers. That's the verb for Pesher in Aramaic. Anyway, it's probably more than you care to know about. Okay, so text and versions. The Septuagint version, so if you don't know what that is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. The Old Testament was translated from Hebrew into Greek, and they started in the 3rd century BC, and it went down into the 1st century or so. So by the time you got around to Jesus, the Jews aren't really reading the Hebrew Bible anymore unless you're a scribe or one of the educated people, because you don't read Hebrew, you don't speak Hebrew. So if you're going to read the Bible, most of them read it in Greek. So they read from this Greek translation called the Septuagint. It's always abbreviated with the LXX for the Roman numeral 70. And so the Septuagint is a really good translation for some books of the Old Testament, like the Pentateuch. They did a really good job. It's like a word-for-word translation like we're used to. Kind of what you might call the New American Standard version of the Old Testament from Hebrew to Greek. But Daniel is more like the Message, okay? It's more like a paraphrase translation. It's not a translation. It's kind of like a paraphrase. So some of the Old Testament books got kind of loosey-goosey when they started translating from Hebrew to Greek, and Daniel would be one of those. So it's more of a paraphrase. It does omit some of the Hebrew text, and it adds stuff to it. Another Greek translation from around the same time is by Theodotion, and it's considered a better translation. So when you look at when Daniel appears in the New Testament, the Matthew verses and a verse in Revelation, they all appear to come from the Septuagint version of Daniel 7:13, but the Hebrew 11:33 appears to come from a different Greek translation of the Old Testament, maybe from Theodotion. So there are 3 lengthy additions inserted into the Greek version that are not found in the Hebrew Aramaic version. The prayer of Azariah and the song of the 3 young men, Susanna and Bel and the dragon. Why do you even need to know about these? If you've ever heard of the Apocrypha, these are in the Apocrypha. So these were never accepted by the Jews in Palestine as scripture. Therefore, I would suggest to you maybe you should not accept it as scripture either. But they were included in the Palestinian canon. They are not found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Therefore, people think that they probably were written outside of Palestine, probably in Egypt, at the same time the Greek translation of the Old Testament was made. But the reason it's important, if you go and you buy a Bible with the Apocrypha in it, those 3 books will be in your Bible. Probably nobody in here has a Bible with the Apocrypha in it, but if you did, these books would be in it. But all Catholic Bibles have the Apocrypha in it, and they treat it as if it is actually Scripture, okay? And so if you have a Catholic Bible, that first book will appear after chapter 3, verse 23, and the other 2 books are chapters 13 and 14 of the book of Daniel. And that's why it's relevant to know about it. And I think that was the last bill, right? Okay. I will just stop there. We only had a few slides left. Does anybody have any questions? We'll finish the intro next week and get into the text, but anybody have any questions for now? Okay. Good to see everybody.